you everyone so much again for taking the time to donate your Saturday to watch my talk. I'm super excited to hear some feedback and the takeaways from you all. But yeah, just welcome to, welcome to the talk. My name is Jen. I am going to be talking about a really lightweight introduction into designing around data and AI specifically. And I think I think Julia mentioned this, but if you have any burning questions, feel free to interrupt me. But like she mentioned, I can do a Q&A session at the end. But just to say again, hello, nice to meet you all. I'm Jen. I'm currently a senior product designer working at C3 AI, and I was originally from Seoul, South Korea. I spent a lot of my life in the Bay Area in California. I ended up going to Savannah College of Art and Design, studying my bachelor's in UX design in Savannah, Georgia. After that, I was able to intern with Google Firebase in Cambridge, Massachusetts, spent some time in Munich, Germany for IBM actually, and then I spent 2 years or so at Austin, Texas, working on IBM IoT. And now I'm currently in San Francisco, again, working at C3.ai. And just to kind of give a kind of high level picture of what my career journey has been like Julia mentioned, I started out working at a USAA, working as a UX design intern. So kind of started out in the fintech space, really interested in mobile products. After that, I was able to do a collaborative student project with Ford Motor Company, focusing on voice user interfaces and autonomous vehicles. After that, I did another student project with Google Maps, working on kind of mobility experiences within urban environments for millennials. And after that, I was able to intern with Google Firebase, specifically working on enhancing and augmenting developer experiences. And I would actually say that this is probably the instance where I really decided that I was interested in designing around lots of data, lots of technical spaces, and kind of taking all of these really kind of challenging, complex systems and really thinking about them from a user and human perspective, which naturally kind of led me into an interest into AI. And that led me to become a product designer at IBM Watson Internet of Things, where I worked primarily on AI insights for spaces and buildings. And like I mentioned today, I currently work as a senior product designer at C3.ai, working on developing tools for machine learning and data analysis and exploration. And I'm happy to actually talk a bit more about the work I do at C3, but maybe that could be saved towards the Q&A. But just to kind of highlight what I want the takeaways of this talk today to be, specifically, I'd love to be able to kind of demystify the concept of AI as a whole. So what I mean by that is that I think that even to this day, there are tons of people who kind of think of AI as a big, scary robot overlord sort of concept. And I think that there's so much value that AI can bring to the table, especially from a design perspective. So I'd love to kind of demystify that concept a little bit. And also the more important piece is basically highlighting ways designers and researchers together can bring this notion of human-centered perspective into AI products. So when we think about AI today, it's really, it feels like a very technical process, which it really is, because machine learning is quite difficult and mathematical. And I think that kind of deters away a lot of designers because they think it's something that's kind of gatekept by engineers and data scientists. But for us to actually work towards a more equitable, inclusive future, we really need to understand how designers can actually bring, again, this human-centered perspective into building AI. So keep in mind that this talk is very high level, and I want it to be a pretty lightweight introduction into the entire concept. So I would be happy to follow up over email or over LinkedIn if anyone has any more specific technical questions about the field. But with that intro being said, I have broken up the talk into a few different sections. So I'm just going to start off by introing why does AI actually matter? What does it mean for society today? Then I'm going to kind of do a really high level split between the concept of automation versus augmentation. After that, I'll go into some of 3 very high level human-centered AI design principles. I'll kind of talk through the idea of testing an AI concept and how we can actually do that as designers. And then I'll briefly touch on the importance of data within this entire process of AI. And finally, I'll give a light note on just AI ethics as a whole, because that, I would say, definitely warrants its own talk, but super, super important. So starting out with why does AI matter? And before I actually go into the exact use cases and impact of AI, I'd love to start off with a really fantastic definition, actually by the pair research group at Google, which stands for People in AI Research Group. And of course, I don't take credit for this definition, but the way that they define artificial intelligence is essentially the science of making machines intelligent so they're able to recognize patterns and get really good at helping people solve specific challenges or sets of challenges. So that's a pretty simple explanation, but specifically, if we want to get a bit more specific here, if we actually think about what machine learning means, machine learning, or ML, is a subfield of artificial intelligence, or AI, that comprises techniques and methods to develop AI by getting specific computer programs to do something without programming super specific rules. So to kind of summarize that even further, AI is the broader field of making machines intelligent and computers understand patterns, whereas machine learning is a subfield that is specifically focused on methods to develop and actually create something that will become an AI. And machine learning typically is something that is extremely technical. There's lots of stats, there's lots of math involved, but I think that at a high level, it is great for you as a designer to be able to understand at least kind of the basic building blocks of what constitutes AI and ML in order to become a better designer as a whole, if you're interested in this space. And just to kind of highlight some examples of how machine learning can be used, here are the two, I would say, most common AI problems or use cases. So we have classification to the left, which is essentially the process of bucketing data into two or more categories. So an example could be, is this a hot dog or not hot dog? Or is this a cat or a dog? Or is it a train or a car, for example? So lots of different use case applications for classification. And compared to regression, regression is the act of predicting continuous numerical values. So rather than these discrete buckets of categories, what you're doing is you're kind of predicting a specific range based off of whatever training data that you may have. So for example, in this case, if we want to predict what would the flight price of a trip from Atlanta to California, what would that be? That would be some type of range typically. So that's based off of continuous time series data. So this is all kind of just more introductory, supplementary context, but just wanted to get that out of the way so we're all on the same page when we talk about AI. And just again, in terms of why does AI actually matter, we have this notion of all these businesses and companies beginning to understand how much AI can actually enhance and augment businesses as a whole. So we actually see a bunch of trends across industries, specifically focusing on enhancing their AI and data science stack within each of these individual companies. As offerings grow, the expectations for AI adoption as well also is growing over the years. So we can see that this is actually a chart from Markets and Markets, I believe, and there's tons of sources from MIT Sloan School of Business, BCG. Essentially, it's clear that in the next decade or so, or even half decade, plenty of companies will begin to increasingly adopt AI's impact within their offerings. And finally, as I'm sure everyone knows, we as a society, we as a human race, I would say, actually have been tremendously growing the amount of data that is generated and collected just worldwide. So obviously, when it comes to actually any type of innovation, data is crucial. To be honest, AI cannot exist without data, and data empowers AI to actually create innovations. So here's just kind of an example, and this is actually from a great resource called Work Toss Robot that I'll actually mention again at the end. But essentially, when it comes to a data set, you're able to kind of create all these different features or parameters. And from those features and parameters, you're able to continuously manipulate and kind of understand and inspect that data, or the computer is able to do that in a way that will eventually generate some type of prediction. So that could be something that's classification, that could be something that's regression. And there's actually a ton of other modeling problems outside of what I mentioned already. But just to highlight again, data is the engine behind all of this innovation. And how does it actually affect our lives today? I think there's already a ton of applications that many of you guys are familiar with. So for example, if we think about Spotify, the way that they actually curate these playlists, these are all by AI recommendations or by AI understanding of the user's individual needs. So if the AI understands that I like these songs, then I probably might like these other songs that have a similar maybe audio profile, for example. So that's something a bit more consumer facing. Here's an example from Scale AI, which for those of you who don't know are a AI company. They previously focused primarily on autonomous vehicles and computer vision, but you can see here that there's actually a ton of different, the AI in this case is actually detecting these boxes, which represent cars, as well as all these other agents within these objects. Here's another example of something a bit more enterprise facing. So Raven.ai is a startup that actually focuses specifically on energy management. And they have a really tremendous offering that allows facility managers and technicians within manufacturing facilities to be able to really quickly and easily understand the predictive maintenance within their systems and their companies. And finally, if we think about healthcare, for example, AI's impact is huge. When we think about Google Brain or Google Medical Brain, we have IBM Health. There's tons of huge corporations really working towards providing healthcare professionals with really robust AI tools to be able to detect things like cancer risk, detect things like patient-doctor compatibility scores. There's a ton of different impacts that AI is able to have within all these different types of spaces. So now that we kind of understand why does AI actually matter, I did want to actually set a really clear distinction between the notion of automation versus augmentation. So what I mean by that is essentially when we talk about automation, this is when AI is performing the task without user involvement to help efficiency. So you can actually think of this kind of like a robot butler, for example. And typically you automate tasks, or you want to automate tasks, when there's undesirable investment of time for the end user. So if something's really time consuming, you can probably try to automate something for the user. If there's less oversight required and just overall lower stakes of that automation process. And also if it's something tedious, like complex calculations, if I'm multiplying 535 times 24, I probably just want to use a calculator instead of doing that by hand. So that kind of thing is always helpful for bringing value to the end user. And here's just an example of what I mean by something that might not be initially apparent as automation. So one of my favorite photo apps is Google Photos, or it is my favorite photo app. And one of my kind of most delightful moments experiencing the app is actually the fact that they automatically, or they perform automation in a way to actually create or pre-create a photo book for you. And of course, you're able to kind of go in and actually manipulate these images and change the images and change the format and everything. But the initial setup of the book is kind of done for you. So the user doesn't have to kind of start from a blank canvas there. And contrast that with something like augmentation, which is essentially when an AI, instead of doing something for the user, they extend the abilities of a user to perform a task. So instead of a robot butler, you can think of a robot coworker, you could say. And typically with automation tasks, when more human cognition or creativity is involved in the task, that's great to kind of augment. And typically when more oversight is required, or there's just higher stakes as a whole. So again, keep in mind when you're automating within AI, you don't want to automate things that potentially have high risks, like risks regarding safety or privacy or security. Those are all items that you want to essentially allow the user to have some agency in. Sorry about that. And here's just an example, or kind of a more creative example. This is a site called ColorMind, which actually allows the user to generate color themes for a specific dashboard. So what they're actually doing is they're not giving a set of color palettes to the user and just saying, hey, use this. They're just giving kind of examples, and from there, the user is actually able to go and kind of manipulate and tweak the colors for their creative need. So in this type of case, it's kind of nice to have a starting point from a design perspective, but then the user actually goes and kind of manipulates and designs the rest. So I think that there's a lot of discourse and kind of concern maybe from the design community about concepts like this replacing designers at the end of the day. I would say that as long as the user, or as long as designers have a critical eye for understanding the user, developing empathy, and actually still flexing their creative muscles, I would say that in my opinion, designers will always be relevant, because we're not just about making things look good or look pretty. We need to understand that we can work with these technical systems to kind of create better and more inclusive products at the end of the day. So now that I've kind of discussed really quickly automation versus augmentation, I want to discuss the kind of 3 very high level human-centered AI design principles that I'd like to share with you all today. And those 3 principles are transparency and context, trust and control, and explainability. And I'll kind of go into each of these with a bit more examples. So transparency and context, the first one, is really about kind of the what, the where, and the when. So when you're designing an AI product, it really is important to ensure that every instance of AI is explicitly called out to show transparency to the end user. So for example, let's say, and this is just an example I mocked up, so this is not a real product, but essentially, let's say we have some type of food finding app like Yelp, where I see 19 results for Thai food in Savannah, Georgia, and we actually see this call out saying, these results are sorted based on your previous interests in ambiance, outdoor dining, and intimate as a keyword. And if the user wants to, they're actually able to go ahead and learn more if they need. And that I'll actually get more into that in a future example. But essentially, the key here is that we're really being explicit about a simple explanation to bring awareness to the user that this is touched by AI. And something like this may not seem like a really big deal, like, okay, cool, the AI knows that I like these things. But when it comes to, let's say, a slightly higher stakes example, in this case, this is actually something I worked on at IBM, but this is a example of a time series of frequency rate within a building for, let's say, a floor, for example. And we actually see this little Watson icon call out, which actually exists at every part of the product that uses AI. So the user understands that if I ever see this icon, I can hover over it, and I see this tooltip that explains, hey, frequency rate uses Watson. It recognizes a pattern in occupancy data and learns a normal pattern. Any deviation is detected. If there's an anomaly, the AI removes it. And basically, again, allowing the user to learn more if needed. So again, these are really for the intention of communicating confidence, to avoid this kind of silo between the system and the user, and basically kind of bringing awareness overall to the fact that there is an AI and it is helpful. So building trust, which is actually a great segue into my next one, or next principle, which is trust and control. So trust and control is really about ensuring that the end user has agency and control. So thinking about things like editability, undoing, overriding, etc., over any actions performed by the AI. So again, just another example, let's say this suspiciously similar to Spotify looking player has this kind of explanation over here, or this X icon over here. And if you hover over it, it says, are you not interested in this type of music? If you dislike the song, you can improve your recommendations. So this is something that's kind of implicit, or it collects implicit user feedback to basically improve the curation of the content that it's serving the user. Whereas this bottom example over here, again, this ambiguous experiment B, let's say I'm a scientist and I'm performing some experiment. And I actually read here explaining, or read this tooltip that explains, oh, your experiment has data that has some anomalies, and the AI model actually your data to remove those anomalies. But in this case, let's say I really care, or I have a really high stakes role as a scientist, and I really want to make sure those anomalies are actually anomalies. So what I'm able to do is actually click here to manually inspect and edit your data. And in that case, I would still have that agency of kind of undoing an AI action, if you will. So again, it's really important to provide both implicit and explicit user control to develop trust within any type of product, service, system, basically literally anything, because AI, just like any software or anything really in the world, has a ton of potential for failure, errors, and just assumptions as a whole. And which brings me to my third point, which is basically explainability. And this is really about the how and the why of the AI. And I kind of touched on this in my first point, but essentially in a lot of cases, not all, some, basically the act of providing more detailed information about the AI. So thinking about what types of attributes affected the AI, how did each attribute factor, and how much did it contribute to the actual final score? What possible values actually interfere or influence these attributes or features. Over all this information, even though it feels a little bit maybe technical and overwhelming, at the end of the day can really provide clarity and trust for the end user. So again, an example here, another feature I worked on while I was at IBM, we really wanted to highlight the importance of explainability within our platform. So thinking about things like, let's say I got some prediction, but what actually influence that prediction. We're able to kind of, here an example is data viz. So we'd be able to show a donut chart, and let's say I got some prediction of occupancy count for a certain date. I'd be able to actually visually see and understand, oh, this prediction was actually really influenced by the day of the week and the month of the year, and then a little bit affected by some other items here. And there's also other ways to display that information, but overall, the user still is able to kind of see or have a lens into why the AI made the decision that it did. And finally, again, this first example is specifically for kind of a more technical user who really has a high stakes role in this type of product. But let's say if you're a Netflix watcher, just kind of browsing through your recommended shows, if I saw information like this just right off the bat, it would probably be a little bit overwhelming. And that's why you don't see this type of explanation as much in a consumer space, because it typically is, again, a little bit overwhelming for some people. But I do think that as companies or
I think she accidentally like got out. That's okay. We'll get in contact with her. But if everyone can just wait a moment as we get Jenn back online, that would be great. Thank you for your patience, everyone. But while we're waiting, I'd love to hear from you all. Like, what's the biggest like aha moment that you've had so far? Because I think for me specifically, I've always just thought AI and ML are so, so scary. Her laptop just shut off randomly and she should be back to, okay, thank you so much for sending that update. Oh my gosh. Tech will do all of this to everyone at some point. So thank you for that update. But anyway, yeah, put in the chat below if there is anything like that's like an aha moment for you, because I think to me, like AI and ML seemed so nebulous until Jenn like actually like just showed us the examples and the meanings. So anyone feel free to add in the chat. Oh yes, the transparency part, it always went unnoticed for me and as well. Like I feel like that's so, I don't know, I feel like I take that for granted because it's so interesting that, you know, like Jenn was saying, like not everyone is going to be shown all of that explanation. Jose says, I'm a product owner and one of the bigger concerns are related with AI adoption. And yeah, the design principles are very fire. I want like I was thinking too, like if anybody knows like some kind of poster or something that I can have up in my room, that would be great. Because I feel like there's constantly so many different things and design principles that are evolving, especially with this. Nettie says automation versus augmentation, the robot butler versus the robot co-worker. And absolutely, that's a huge analogy for me. And I like watch the Twilight Zone, so like there's a specific episode where they have like a robot butler, and I was just like, wow, the future is here. So for sure love that. And Vicky says learning augmentation and automation for sure. And I'm super like interested too, and I want to ask Jenn like how she kind of went from like, you know, all the things that she was doing before and like the transition, I guess, in the thought process of going into AI and ML. So I'm very, very curious about that.
laptop. I'm so sorry about that.
You're
Let
totally
me,
great. We were able to get that update. So we're so grateful for that update, and we just wanted to make sure that everything was okay on your end. So feel
everything,
free.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, for sure. I was just gonna say, like, feel free to begin whenever you're ready. And just we're just gonna make sure too that we have all the like all the screen sharing options still up and awkward.
Perfect, yeah. Could I get permission to share? I'm actually logged in from a different Zoom account. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. Again, I really apologize for the technical difficulty here.
No
Um,
worries. It happens. I was saying it happens to all of us. So, um, awesome. Take it
Cool,
away.
fantastic. I'll just pick up where I left off. So, essentially, when it comes to explainability, I think I was just saying that when it comes to more technical and kind of high stakes positions, you do want to have that explainability really front and center. But when it comes to, again, let's say if you're kind of a more casual consumer user, it is great to have those options highlighted. But I would say that definitely not as obvious in a lot of cases. So that's ultimately kind of up to you as the designer and you and your team, depending on the product that you're trying to offer. Do you need all of this technical information to be surfaced immediately? Do you want to kind of hide it away through progressive disclosure? Again, that's kind of a team conversation and it's contextual. Cool. So those are the three concepts or the three principles. When it comes to testing an AI concept, obviously, I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with user testing and the importance of user testing. So user testing is also important in AI. So just like any other software product, obviously testing and validating is really important to not just the design process, but kind of the end user and the impact to the user with the AI. So even though you may not be the person actually creating the AI or actually the data scientist working with manipulating the data, what I would like to really urge all of you, if you do end up going into this field, to kind of advocate for, is the importance of collaboration throughout this entire end-to-end process. So again, if we think about just the traditional design process, we can think of kind of lo-fi wireframes, and then you do some user testing, you do some interviews, etc. This process still holds for any type of product that uses AI. The only difference is that it's kind of a bit harder to prototype. So I'm just going to share two very simple AI concept validation methods. The first one, some of you may have heard already, but it's called the Wizard of Oz test. And basically, it's kind of a vague type of test, but the idea is Wizard of Oz testing allows the user to kind of interact with a make-believe or pretend AI system. So there's no AI that's actually been coded. There's no real product that actually has that AI. It's kind of the goal of the test is primarily to better understand how mental models of the users perceive the AI. So just an example, and this is actually, funnily enough, an example I used when I was a student in school working with Ford. Let's say if you were trying to test a voice assistant and the kind of value of different personalities within voice assistants. So in this case, what you could do is you have the participant in one room, and let's say you tell them that they're interacting with an AI, but what they're actually doing is just speaking to someone who's pretending to be an AI. And you can see that, let's say the customer or the participant selects, I want my AI to be kind of sarcastic, and they press that button. Then the person in the other room pretending would kind of, Wizard of Oz style, manipulate their responses to the participant in a way that actually invokes that kind of simulated scenario. So Wizard of Oz is kind of just a fancy way of saying you make believe, or you have a make believe AI. And there's a lot of kind of smoke and mirrors there, but it's not applicable in every situation, but it definitely is helpful when you don't really know how exactly to kind of create a prototype that actually incorporates this type of system. The other kind of more common use case, I would say, is prototyping with participant data. And what I mean by this is, again, keyword here is if the users consent to this, basically being able to incorporate personal information. So things like photos and media can kind of help simulate more realism in the actual participant responses. So for example, I actually think that Google Photos use case might be an interesting thing to test like this. So let's say you say ahead of time, hey, we're going to run a participant study with you all. Please send in like whichever photos or personal photos that you have that you're comfortable with sharing to be used in this test. And then from there, what we as the designers can do is actually take those photos that the user sent us and incorporate them into the prototype. And let's say if we were testing that photo book feature, we could potentially just say in the user test, hey, if you look at your photo books tab in the Google Photos app, you'd be able to see kind of a photo book curated with those actual user photos included. So again, that kind of elicits more authentic responses at times. And of course, always remember to destroy any copies of participant data afterwards. Personal information is super important here. But yeah, in this type of case, it's really again kind of smoke and mirrors, but typically you can experience a bit more authenticity in this type of use case because they kind of see what they're familiar with and they're able to really put themselves into the situation. And the final thing I'll kind of touch on over here with the principles is the importance of data. So this is kind of a giveaway question, but basically let's say we have a user need, and then from that user need, we want to create some type of AI output, or let's say it's a prediction or some type of classification or whatever value we want to bring to the user in this point. The only thing that's missing in this step is the data part. And obviously this talk is about data and AI, and I've already kind of mentioned how important data is within this entire process. Without data, there is no AI. So I think that it's helpful and relevant to kind of address these few different questions as a designer working in the AI space. So these are just kind of some general thoughts you can have as you go through your process, but things like what type of data might I require for this type of prediction? So again, if I bring up that Google Flights example, how would you say that an AI would actually be able to make those predictions? They would probably have to have a lot of user data and also weather data and also just climate data, for example. And within each of those data categories, within each data set, there's a lot of kind of attributes or features that you can elicit from those data sets. So let's say, for example, let's say one of our data sets has to do with the city that the destination is for the flight. You can think about things like the cost of the city, the typical duration of days that people spend in that city for vacation. You can think about the weather and how that impacts the travel patterns within the user groups. So things like that. So really understanding, I need data. Which data do I need? How can I actually get it? Which is the second question, how would my team actually be able to source this data? And is it ethical at the end of the day? And I bring up the ethical piece because, again, really in a world where our personal data is so easily breached by pretty much anyone or any type of company, it's really important to be able to, again, reinforce that sense of trust within the user and make sure that we follow the proper GDPR guidelines for data usage as well. So ethics are huge there. And then finally, what are the potential risks of collecting this data? I think that, again, you can always kind of default to open source data sets. There's a ton of them out there. But I would say that it's important to think about considerations like privacy, security, and even just not security, but not just web security, but also real life security. Is there anything that this data would actually do that might actually expose a user or actually cause them harm? So I think that these are all really important considerations to think about, which is why I actually think that it's great that there's a growing field in this notion of AI ethics and AI ethics researchers specifically being developed kind of worldwide. It's really, really amazing being able to see all the progress and passion going into this field. Which finally brings me to my last point, and I'll kind of just really briefly touch on this. Like I mentioned, there's a ton of, I think that this warrants its own talk, but there's a ton of examples of how lacking sufficient training data or machine learning model oversight has proven to have really disastrous consequences. And by disastrous, I mean those could be like racism related, they could be socioeconomic related, they can be mental health related. Like these are all really serious things, and they're not. It just kind of goes to show that in the real world, you can't have technology be completely siloed away from societal issues, social issues, and all these other important things that plague the human race, really. So I guess I'll kind of close on a final note of, as designers, it's really crucial to continuously wield a critical eye towards the products and services we work on, because ultimately, all the things that you work on will touch the real world. There's always a chance that there is some oversight and there can be a product that actually harms or really hurts the feelings of someone that ends up using it. So just kind of reinforcing that ethics is important in AI. And then finally, I wanted to, again, kind of thank some of the key resources from this talk. Like I mentioned, I would highly recommend anyone who actually is really interested in design and AI, but definitely check out Google's People in AI research group, and that's typically abbreviated to PAIR. They have some really, really fantastic resources on just a lot of what I covered today, but diving in a lot deeper. Like I mentioned, there's this site called Walk Toss Robot, which is really, really great. It's also kind of a lightweight introduction into some of the automation versus augmentation principles and some more items that I didn't cover today as well. There's this site or this organization called AIXdesign.co that actually is kind of newer and also works towards collaborating and kind of enhancing these conversations between designers, researchers, data scientists, AI practitioners worldwide. So they're also great. And finally, Towards Data Scientists, Towards Data Science is actually a Medium publication, which is really great. And again, I would say that if you are serious about going into AI as a designer, I do think that this level of data science experience, or not experience, but knowledge, at least at a high level, can actually really take you from a good designer to a great designer. So I would definitely recommend, if you're interested, kind of checking out these really introductory data science concepts. And actually Kaggle, which is also by Google, is another really great resource for kind of more lightweight introductions to these concepts. Yeah, that brings me to the end of my talk. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to spend your Saturday afternoon with me or morning with me. And again, I really, really apologize for the technical difficulty literally in the middle of my presentation. So yeah, I'm super happy to take questions, or if anyone has any things they're curious about, I'm happy to discuss that now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jen. And again, no worries at all about the technical difficulties. It happens to all of us. And so I actually have a collection of questions that we have to ask you. So I'm very excited to hear what your thoughts are. So Hinal asks, how do you balance the transparency when the goal of AI is to get more like human? And then they say, I speak specifically for voice-based AI and them having human like sentence fillers like how do you handle transparency in such cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say I definitely spoke about AI in very broad cases here. I think that voice AI specifically is actually a bit more nuanced than a lot of the other examples I showed today. But yeah, I think that in those cases, ultimately it is a trade-off, right? You can have a voice assistant that sounds kind of like, if you just do text to speech on the Mac or on Google, you hear a very obviously robotic voice.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you have someone who actually is I think Google Duo was the feature where the Google Assistant can make calls for you. That truly does sound human, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the question there is how does the user actually react to an AI that feels more human? And I think that answer really varies across the spectrum, which is why it's difficult to kind of prescribe a serious answer there or a specific answer. What I will say is that I think going towards the future, it's important for us to understand that as we progress as a society, there's more people, or there are younger people who are continuously already growing up with AI. And when those people all turn like 20, 30, 40, etc., what will society look like then? And what will the perception societally of AI be then? And it likely will be really different. And I think that, again, I know that's kind of a non-answer. I mean, it is a non-answer, but I think that, again, it's hard to say without actually really understanding and interviewing users, which I'm sure that the Google Duo team did. But yeah, sorry, that's not really a good answer. But
No. I think that makes a lot of sense because it seems like it's so new and there's like so many, it's like constantly evolving. So I feel like an answer today could be totally different from an answer tomorrow or like a year from now, like you said. So I totally think that that's valid. And I actually have a question that is somewhat related to that. And speaking of different technologies that have already been developed about that do use more humanized voice or do you specifically use robotic voices, like are there any like places that we can learn a little bit more about policies around design around AI or ML that you know of, or are there resources for us to specifically look at like what are the standards for like protocol safety, all of that? Do you know of any resources that we could look through?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would definitely say that people in AI research group that I mentioned from Google, I think has the most kind of comprehensive, digestible set of resources and protocols.
Mhm.
The only issue, the reason that they're not as kind of crystallized as a lot of other technologies is because, again, AI is kind of, I mean, it definitely still is in its infancy. And I think that for us to kind of prescribe, again, like these specific protocols, do this for this and do that for that, can at the end of the day just be recommendations gently. And I think that typically, I'm sure that within the next few years, we'll come up with a more solid list. But yeah, I definitely would refer to those resources that I mentioned. These are all fantastic for what you just asked.
Awesome. Well, yeah, for sure. We're going to be sharing those on our Students of UXD page. And now Young Yi asks, how do AI designers work with different roles? So the ML engineer, data science, UX researcher, PM, etc. And they also ask, what are the best practices in, I guess, collaborating with all of these different stakeholders?
Yeah, that is a really great question because I actually think that's the one part of the talk that I didn't really discuss enough about, I think. But collaboration is huge when it comes to AI products. So even for my case currently, I work pretty closely. I would actually say I work with designers and more data scientists and PMs and engineers. And typically the way that we kind of tackle an ML related problem or AI related problem is we basically start from really understanding, again, the high level technical building blocks of what's happening, if you will. So again, like machine learning can be very complicated and mathematic, but I think that if you understand the really high level fact that basically at the end of the day, you have a data set. From that data set, you extract features or attributes, and from those features, you basically perform a bunch of computations and you calculate all these weights and biases for each feature, and you do that enough times or however many times. At the end of that kind of cycle, you get a prediction. Again, whether that's a classification prediction or a regression prediction or clustering prediction, that's all up in the air. But I think, again, understanding that concept at a really high level, I actually would say is a prerequisite in a lot of cases.
Mhm.
And typically, yeah, definitely be friends with your data scientist. I think that they are awesome and they do such important work. And what I found to be helpful is basically kind of just sitting down one-on-one with my data scientist and asking like literally just asking them questions about ML or machine learning in general, because yeah, again, that really influences the way that you prioritize information within these different products.
Right.
I guess in terms of best practices, I would say that's the most important one. I think other items is, and this definitely doesn't just exist for AI designers, but make sure you're kind of evangelizing human-centered design and impact and research, just because obviously in a lot of cases, I think traditionally data science, engineering, and design has been kind of siloed. And you see that improving across the board, but I do think it's a bit more siloed still within the AI and ML space. So I would definitely make sure you stress the importance of the design process to those folks.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's so important that, like you said, like as UX designers, it's almost like our responsibility to constantly, like you said, like I like the term evangelize, and also like just remember the importance of our users as well. So now there's another question from, I believe it's Kian. Have you reached out to any databases that are related to user behavior for AI products? So I'm curious, like Kian, if you have any like clarification specifically, like if Jenn has used these databases, or like I'd love to hear more. I think Kian, you're in the call, or Chian, I think.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. Like,
No
yeah,
worries.
exactly. That's my question is about. I'm so excited. My question is picked, so I'm a little like overwhelmed. All right. So, right. So, I'm curious about, have you ever used any data from any databases? Because I'm curious, like, if there's any databases related to user behaviors, particular for AI product users.
Yeah, that's another great question. I would say that it's kind of hard to have one comprehensive user database, just because the beauty of machine learning and also the difficulty of machine learning is that you have to be very specific about the type of data you select. So I would say that depending on the modeling problem, like let's say, again, bringing up the Google Flights example, you would probably get lots of data from, I would say maybe travel. There, I think there is like a open source traveler database information set. There's definitely also, what else is there? There's lots of open source climate data, lots of open source city data. When it comes to user data, the reason that a lot of it isn't open source is for, I would say, obvious privacy reasons. But I think that when it comes to things like, let's say, distribution of age within cities or distribution of interest within, like let's say college information distribution, or where do people go? Like if I grow up in the Bay Area, where do most people go for college? Like that type of information you can find, but it typically is kind of either restricted or it can be a bit difficult to get more detailed data sets in that case. But I would say, like for me, in my experience, I've usually, whenever I've kind of done some lightweight data manipulation in like Python, for example, there actually, if you look up just like sample data sets, you get a bunch of like CSVs or JSON files that you can use just for practice. And I actually think that if you are interested in the data science side of things, it's kind of nice to be able to do that with these random sample data sets. So I guess short answer is no, not within my current role, but they do exist, but they might be hard to find.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super interesting, because I didn't also recognize, depending on the type of information, it could be, more scarce to find those resources. So that's super insightful. And Nettie has a question that I think, can relate to what we were just talking about, is how do you approach strategies for implementing AI into a product? And I would go so far as like, maybe for people like, some people on this call that would want to go into designing for AI and ML, like how do we start implementing those into our case studies, even though, we don't necessarily have a data scientist that we're working with and so on. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is really applicable, especially for students. So I would say actually, this is kind of a good framework, or not even a framework, but just a perspective to offer when it comes to using AI. So I would say, and this is obvious for everyone, but always start with the user need, of course. So when it comes to basically using AI, there's no point of using it unless it's bringing value, right? But where does the value come from? The value comes from a need at the end of the day. So I actually don't even think it's that different from just the regular framework of creating products and designing products as designers. Let's say, again, an example user need is, sorry, I keep going to the Google Flights example, but it's just such a great product. But Google, let's say as a flight user, I want to be able to, or it would be helpful for me to be able to understand when prices are high or low, so I can get notified and kind of book flights when they're at their lowest, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that user or that design team and development team started from that need, right? And
Right.
The way that kind of designers and product managers and engineers work in a lot of cases are they write user stories. So you kind of put yourself in the perspective of the user. So I, as a business traveler, consumer traveler, frequent traveler, like rare traveler, like there are all these different type of personas as well. So I, as this persona, want to do XYZ so that I can do XYZ or ABC.
Mm-hmm.
And once you kind of have a set of user stories, from there you can basically understand or begin to think about where can AI actually provide an output that can address that need. And maybe what I'm saying is really obvious, but I think that, again, a lot of people will like chuck in AI into their product because, like, I don't know, for cool points. But it always should start from the user need at the end of the day. So again, kind of long answer to say, I don't have a specific framework, but I do think that this paradigm, I think actually helps kind of frame a lot of these features.
Yeah, that I honestly think that this is a really helpful, just like step-by-step way to think about, AI. Cause I think that something that I was voicing is that it seems like such a nebulous, like data and AI, especially for someone like me that doesn't necessarily like seeing a bunch of numbers and data and gets overwhelmed by those things. Like I get scared. It seems so abstract. But I feel like, knowing that, our roles as UX designers is to identify those user needs and figure out how to create a solution. like having this particular thing that I'm sure we've screenshotted already to share is like absolutely important. So thank you so much. I'm sure everyone here is super thankful to having your insight to such like a new topic for us UX designers. So that I believe was our last question. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to connect with Jenn. We added her LinkedIn, and I'm sure you can just find her super easily on social media as well. Thank you so much, Jenn, for spending your time with us and for giving us such amazing different like resources that we can check out. And everybody, thank you so much for coming. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your weekend, and make sure to submit your feedback for our events. We always love to hear how we can improve. Make sure to tag us and Jenn in your takeaways at StudentsofUXd on LinkedIn and also on Instagram. And make sure to check out our upcoming event with Women Talk Design and Ladies at UX Boston. And Jenn, thank you again so much for spending your time with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Julia, Vicky, and everyone else. You guys are amazing. And yeah, again, feel free to reach out or email. There's a ton of topics I didn't cover within the whole space of AI and design. So more than happy to set up time with anyone in the call if they want to discuss more. But yeah, thank you so much again. This was great, and have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.
All right. Bye, everyone.